I just want to put forward the pig business 6 big asks of the MEPs now when they're looking at the common agricultural policy. First of all, I'd really like everybody to recognise that the profitability of factory farming depends on externalising its true costs onto the broader community, which is what you saw in the film. Therefore, please, can we ensure that the agricultural policy post-2013 moves European agriculture away from industrial livestock production to sustainable and humane forms of animal husbandry? And please, more autonomous farms. In other words, the feed for the pig, rather than it coming from miles away, which is increasing greenhouse effect, which is making the pig farmers dependent on a very volatile global market, which means, as you saw recently, the pig feed is so huge that they're going bankrupt because the supermarket's not paying them properly for their produce. So, please, more local production for the feed as well. So, also, from this, please make more money available and make it mandatory for member states to take up the subsidies to move from intensive livestock production to extensive livestock production. Now, we would also, number 3, like to introduce a ban on the prophylactic use of antibiotics, i.e. the preventative use. Now, I don't know why I'm asking for yet another law when I'm afraid to say that you haven't been very good at enforcing, let alone strengthening, the existing EU directive on the welfare of pigs. Now, I have to say, I understand why these laws are not being enforced by the states, the member states, because across the EU the rules may be the same, but each country varies in its ability and its desire to enforce the laws. And that is because if cheaper pork is coming into your country and is going to force your farm into bankruptcy unless they disobey your EU directives, then they're going to disobey them. This is transnational competition from companies like Smithfield, who can afford to comb the globe for good investment climates. Now, good investment climates for agribusiness means cheap currencies, low wages, compliant governments offering favourable tax incentives, lax environmental and animal welfare standards, and poor standards at work. Now, Poland was one such country whose neoliberal government originally welcomed Smithfield. And this is proof with a little quote from Larry Pope, who was the CEO of Smithfield at the time. We've got people in Western Europe who make 20 euros an hour, when you've got people in Eastern Europe who make 1 or 2 euros an hour. Though you've got land in Western Europe, land in Eastern Europe, they virtually give you. Plants in Western Europe are very expensive. Plants in Eastern Europe, they will virtually give you for small dollars. So, what happened was that the local people were horrified by the likes of Smithfield that arrived in their villages, and they voted for the Law and Justice Party to try and improve the regulations. So, apparently, the CEO then said, "Oh, Poland's not being very nice to us, we're off to Romania." They didn't say this, but I know it was to take advantage of its weak powers of enforcement. So now Romanian pork is going to flood into every single EU country's meat producers and bankrupt the local farmers. So frankly, pig business would like to see food taken out of the global free trade treaties. I want to see our farmers protected from the vagaries of the global economy. Now, this view is shared by MEPs and NGOs across Europe, not least the FoodSolve CAP group, which is 350 NGOs across Europe who advocate the 4th option for the Common Agricultural Policy. Now, for number 5, I'm not going to be that radical because obviously I want to take you with me. And that is, I would like you, therefore, to just allow governments to procure high welfare pork for their public services from local producers. And don't let that be an infringement on the free trade treaties. Now, if you would like the public to take it into their own hands to mend this broken food economy, I'd like number 6 to be to introduce mandatory method of production labelling for pork products. Egg-laying chickens from batteries are labelled as such. Law. People have a right to know if their food has been produced in intensive farms, as well as when it's been raised in friendly, high-welfare farms. Now, it would be helpful for us if, in the back of your programme, it says the 6 asks. I would really be grateful if you'd put your name in capitals at the bottom and put comments on that form so that we can work with you in future. So I'm really grateful for the 3 MEPs that are here tonight, and I hope you can take this forward. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everybody. I think that the film that we've just seen doesn't require any commentary. I think it gives a very good description of the reality of industrialization of agricultural production today. And I think that the example of pig farming is an excellent example of what is happening in all agricultural sectors. So I think this debate is, first of all, a debate on pig farming itself, but it's also something which is relevant for the whole of CAP reform, and we have to see it in that light. I think if we look only at the economic and social aspects of this, the thing that strikes me, and has done for many years, is that the development of these industrial pig farms have direct consequences in terms of destroying jobs, the jobs of the many farmers in regions who were the ones who traditionally bred pigs. So this industry has been built on as a result of the crisis in agriculture, the fact that prices have gone up and gone back down again, and which have meant that the farmers who were competitive, who were the most competitive, or who found it easiest to face up to these difficulties, have remained, and the others have been eliminated, and their holdings have been bought up by those who have been able to retain their position and expand their manufacturing, expand their production. And the fact that we have let these big industrial groups get to this position is a result of the fact that Europe has been incapable of properly regulating pig farming and regulating prices and volumes. And I think that's the first thing that needs to be said. The first thing that I have noticed, that deregulation and the fact that the pig meat market has been left open, that was the first cause of the elimination of small producers, and that is what has led these big operations in and has led to concentration of production. So I think that's a very important phenomenon. Today we find ourselves in a situation where we see increasing concentration of production through the firms that have been just mentioned here, but also others such as Tyson Foods, Cargill. These companies are also getting to a position where they dominate production and they're able to concentrate production. So we're moving from a system which was controlled by small farmers, and I think that Robert Kennedy Jr. makes this point very well. We're moving from that system to a production system which is controlled by large groups. The large groups which very often supply or control the whole supply chain. So they are the ones who are dominating the market today. And that obviously has major social consequences. The first one, which I already mentioned, is the fact that many farmers are no longer employed or be able to work in production. It's also led to a change in the food system and diets, because if you have a production method which is distributed more evenly across the territory, that has a very different effect to these very concentrated plants. So we are changing the whole of our farming system and also the social fabric of our regions. Now, I know the situation in France better than the situation in Poland, so I won't go on for very much longer. I think it's probably more interesting at this point to give the floor to people who work in the field. And I think that René Loy, who's been a pig farmer for many years and who is also a member of the regional council in Brittany, will be able to give us some examples based on the situation in Brittany.
Merci à José. Bonjour à tous.
Thank you, José. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me just say very quickly, I was a pig farmer from 1974 up until 2004. So when I started at the age of 20, from that point on, I saw the different stages of restructuring in pig farming in one of the areas of Europe in which there is greatest concentration. When I started up, there were as many producers in my department, my region, as there are in France today. And it's true, today, looking at this excellent film and look at the points that were made in it, it is quite clear that we farmers are not the ones that are responsible for the situation. It is the politicians and the European Commission, we feel, who have allowed these agricultural policies, which offer us no prospects for the future, to develop in the way in which they have. So the reason I came here today is because I feel that by taking this initiative of starting a debate on pig farming, we are bringing up these questions in the right place at the right time in history, because the European Parliament has co-decision on agriculture. We have an agriculture commissioner who is hearing the questions that we are asking and who is reacting in a different way than the reactions that we've had in the past. So as a farmer and as a farmer's representative, I would like to work with you to re-establish what has been destroyed. Why? I won't go back to the jobs issue, although that is key, but there's just one point that I would make. In the big pig farms in France, employers find it difficult to find people who want to work there, because they're not very enjoyable jobs to be stuck in a building, a big barn for 8 or 10 hours a day. What we see in my region and in other regions in Europe, that there are a lot of young people who would like to settle in the countryside. They would like to be farmers, but they want to have different production methods. They want to provide high-quality products and products which protect our fragile environment, and a product which actually meets the consumer's expectations. So I think given the situation, we cannot continue to wait and sit back while this catastrophe happens. Back at home in Brittany, we have seen successive plans to try and deal with the problem of water quality. Over 40 years, 3 billion has been spent trying to re-establish high quality and good quality water. Today we are talking about problems in agriculture, and when we concentrate agriculture, it is impossible to use techniques which are non-aggressive for the environment. So today I would just say there are some fundamental questions that we need to raise, and we cannot wait for economic actors to raise these issues. They will not do that. We have proposals about how we can achieve high quality and greener production. In my region, which is 6% of agricultural territory in France. We produce 70% of produce, and we are 20th out of 22 regions in terms of value added. And that means that the farmers are not the ones who are benefiting from this system. It is the different actors, the other actors in the system, the different stakeholders. The reason why if we continue this method of concentration, the system of concentration, it requires a huge amount of capital, and this is something that young farmers cannot do and cannot get involved in. So in terms of the region and young farmers, I think this really is a fundamental question. And as you heard earlier, there are a number of demands that are being put forward, and the ball is now in the court of the politicians here in Brussels. Decisions need to be taken, and they need to be taken during the debate on the new agricultural policy. We cannot have the same kind of labeling for a product which comes from small-scale agriculture and for a product which comes from industry and farming. And I've never seen any label which clearly indicates that a product has come from an industrial farm, but I think we can't allow this to be hidden anymore. Society demands transparency, and it is also asking for a form of agriculture which respects human health and the environment. So decisions need to be taken, and they need to be taken quickly. And the second thing I would say is that we need to have democratic instruments at a European level. We could use the communalization of the markets to properly regulate production, because for the last 4 years we have seen overproduction which has killed off the most vulnerable operators, and one lobby after another is queuing up in Brussels to ask the European Commission to accept their cessation plan so that the market will be properly regulated. But we don't have too many farmers in Europe. We simply have overproduction in certain sectors. It's a different problem. So it is high time that we had a debate and high time for change. And it's important that we should be able to establish a different system which will allow for healthy food production system. Bringing this back to farmers is a real challenge, and we have seen, whether it's in Europe or elsewhere in the world, that food crises are a result of this kind of supply system in the livestock sector. We have a lot of examples at the moment. Just one of those is the dioxin crisis. And I would like to ask the European Commission to really look at what is happening with the products imported from elsewhere, because I think that there are different things that will have to be addressed together. I'll leave it at that for the moment, but I would just like to say that as a farmer, I really wanted to come and speak to you here in this debate, because we want politicians to shoulder their responsibilities for once, and I have confidence in you today that you will do that.
Je parle ici aujourd'hui au nom du mouvement européen.
I'm speaking on behalf of the European Movement for Food Sovereignty and a different CAP. FoodSovCap in short. This movement was started in 2009, about 2 years ago. It includes many civil society organizations at a European level and at national level. We include farmers' organizations, environmental organizations, development organizations, animal welfare and public health organizations. Our main priority is to suggest a new form of CAP and food sovereignty. There are two things. Last year we made a European food statement, which you can still sign online. It's a declaration about European food. And with researchers and economists, we published a proposal for a different common agricultural policy. You can also find that at the entrance to the room. Why do we support the Pig Business Initiative? Well, our movement is made up of citizens and taxpayers And for us, the externalized cost of factory farming is too high. It's what I would call the negative multifunctionality of factory farming. And as the film has shown, whether it's socially, whether it's in terms of human health and animal health, or in terms of the environment, or whether it's a monoculture of soya in South America, or whether it's in terms of quality of meat or animal welfare, it's wrong. So the citizens must challenge this factory farming. We want it to be abandoned gradually. Millions of tons of soya are imported. They're made into pork and manure in Europe, and then we export, but we do export the pork, but not the manure. And this is not only nonsensical in terms of the environment, but it also makes pig farming very dependent on exports and imports. It depends on speculation and on the rate of the dollar. This is why we see the cost of cereals and soya going up, and this is why we see this toxin scandal, dioxin scandal again in Germany. And it's consumers, taxpayers who pay for this. Yesterday, on the 8th of February, there was the first member of an advisory group of pig farmers from 27 member states in Europe. It was hosted by the European Commission. But unfortunately, throughout the day, the European Commission listened to COPA and the industry. All three of them don't have a solution. There is a crisis, but all they can think of is more subsidies for pig farming, which will go to the same people. They want to restructure production, so that means less farmers, more pork. But it doesn't help the small farmers, and it will cost taxpayers as well, because they have to pay for what the farmers get from the market. It's up to the European Parliament, I believe, to stop this. There's been too much regulation of the market. We haven't really tackled the causes of the crisis in pig farming. There aren't too many farmers in Europe. There are too many pigs. And we should produce pork in a different way. Many farmers are already doing this. There must be a compulsory link between the animal and the land. The pigs must be fed from local production using European vegetable proteins, and we must promote different breeds of pig. And it must be diverse breeds of pig, and we have to try and stop structural surpluses or shortages. This is absolutely necessary if farmers are going to get a fair and stable price, which represents the cost of sustainable production. We also must fairly and transparently share out the added value right down the production chain. That's a real problem now, because the big distributors don't want to pay more where production costs are going up and up. Added value at the moment goes into the pockets of the big industries and the big distributors, and the farmers don't benefit. In conclusion, let's limit the number of pigs per farm. For society, it's better to have 100 family farms which are sustainable rather than one big factory farm. There aren't too many farmers, but there are too many pigs in these big or huge factory farms.
I wanted to thank the people who organised today's meeting and Tracy for bringing her film here. I think some of the points you've made are very important, but just wanted to make one point really, because I've got your list of big asks here, and I think they're all fine. But you don't have to wait for the Common Agricultural Policy reform for some of them, because they're not part of the CAP reform. One of them, on mandatory food labelling, will come back to this Parliament for second reading very soon. It's not linked to CAP. And the problem was last time we actually had the Parliament put in amendments to have obligatory country of origin labelling on meat products. And that was defeated in this Parliament. So we have to get a campaign going to... I think a lot of people who voted didn't understand what they were actually voting because they followed their group line and they didn't quite see. And we have to link these things better so people understand that when they talk, they think it's because they're lobbied by big companies and supermarkets and all kinds of people, that this is about the same issue. So that's coming back within the next 4 months. So it's not part of... Don't wait for the big debate on common agricultural policy reform. The other thing to say is, unfortunately, the decision on CAP reform will not be taken here in this House, of course. We will have a say for the first time. I think our second speaker, our Breton farmer, said this. The first time ever, the Parliament will have co-decision rights over common agricultural policy reform. But, of course, we need agreement with 27 ministers as well, and the European Commission to put a good proposal on the table. So it's a triangular system of decision-making and a lot of people involved. And so a lot of work has to be done if we are to change our approach on the common agricultural policy. And then to ask our panellists, one of the problems in the debate on the common agricultural policy reform in the past is that there's been a sort of a north-south split, with the French coming into the south in this debate, in the sense of about how much money we put into it versus defending farmers. But the problem is we always defend farmers in general. And we've got to start looking at what farmers get what money from the common agricultural policy. I mean, our colleague at the end there mentioned, Mr. Chopin mentioned export subsidies for Smithfield and companies like that. Many people who defend farmers have often defended export subsidies without realising they're going to these big industrial farmers. And not only do these big industrial farmers put your farmers out of business, they put farmers in West Africa out of business because they can't compete either with this kind of cheap dumped meat on their markets. So I hope in the MEPs that we will have a much more sophisticated debate in Parliament in the common agricultural policy about which farmers get what subsidies, because too much of this CAP at the moment goes to these big industrial farmers, not pig farmers, but they got their money the other way. I was interested to see that, how they got their money through the EBRD. Now, we should be looking at that because we don't have... it made me think, what control do we have as elected politicians of who gets what money from the EBRD? And I was speaking to Catherine here, who sits on Regional Policy Committee, and it's probably a cohesion policy area. So there are lots of different committees have to be involved in this to actually get a grip of all these different things that are happening, which are pushing European farming down this totally unsustainable, totally unfair model which affects farmers, it affects our environment. I know Dan's going to speak about the environmental impacts. But there are things we can do in the next 6 months about food labelling. I hope colleagues here will look very hard when it comes back in 6 months and make sure you look hard at the country of origin labelling and don't just follow a group line which is being pushed by big business.
At a certain point, certain decisions and our stance are defeated by the general approach. Because if we talk about certain lack of means in the European Union, we always point to CAP, that we have inefficient agriculture. But let's us see what are the achievements of CAP. But I have a more specific question. The problem is in the scale of production and in its intensivity, because this influences the profitability, and this results from the certain conditions that have been set. And if we do not impose these conditions on imported goods and on these companies that produce in such a way that they destroy environment, well, it all comes down to the fact that their goods are cheaper. So there are distortions. Our competition is distorted, and that is why the European model of agriculture is losing out, and it will continue to do so. the average income of farmers is at 60% of the average general income, including 50% from European funds. But the problem is in subsidies. Through payments, through direct payments, we want to influence competitiveness, and then we want every hectare to be competitive, irrespective of whether it's a 10th or 100th hectare. Another problem are the living conditions in rural areas, infrastructure, access to services, education. Why do people leave rural areas? This is one of the questions that we should answer as well. There are certain challenges that we have to face, such as providing food for Europeans. In Europe, there are 80 million people that live below the level of poverty. In this rich Europe, but we know what the situation is in a broader context in the world by the year 2050. And I would like to say a few words on certain problems concerning this huge concentration. But it requires high quality of technologies. When you have high concentration, technology has to be very sophisticated. And the examples that were given here, it was the example of the first stage after free market economy was introduced in Poland. This big capital wanted to make a lot of money, trying to use all the legal lacunae and so on and so forth. We started, after this transitional period, we started building small slaughterhouses, which we then had to close because external experts said so, because they didn't meet the standards of the European Union. So these problems are very complex. And I repeat it very often that these instruments that you talk about have to be written into the financing principles of the CAP. Some people say it's not good to have small herds, and then some people say it's bad to have big herds. We have to set certain limits. If the herd is too big, and then if the herd is too small, there's not enough manure to fertilize the land. Well, we know what the British Conservatives think about CAP. Maybe we should try to convince other parties to that approach. Some people say there are certain bans in Europe, but then there is no ban on soya feed. That's the question of profitability, because then we're going to kill off our farmers if they can't use the soya feed, and that's the question of choice. We should try to maintain the organic character of our farms, so that we maintain appropriate relations in animal and plant production. And these are very difficult questions, but well, the Parliament needs farmers that are more active.
Thank you.
I think that we do indeed have a major problem with the legitimacy of the Common Agricultural Policy. If we want the European citizens to finance the CAP, then that policy has to have legitimacy gained through responding to the citizens' needs, because it is with European taxpayers' money that the CAP is financed. And if the CAP is promoting agriculture which destroys the environment and produces bad quality industrial products, I can't see why the European citizens would want to finance that. So I think that's important, and I think as a Parliament we need to make it very clear to all of our colleagues that we are not the ones who decide, it is the European citizens who decide, and we are their representatives. Then the second thing, as regards support for industrial agriculture and factory farming. One thing that strikes me today in the CAP, where we have the first pillar and the second pillar. The first pillar is direct aid, and those are very unevenly distributed at the moment. 75% of the aid goes to 25% of agricultural holdings, and that's unacceptable. So we have a very unjust situation between farmers themselves and between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and we need to redress the balance and have a greater justice among farmers in Europe, because things cannot continue as they stand at the moment. Then you have the second pillar, and I think that the second pillar needs to be completely revamped. The point of the second pillar, what the second pillar does at the moment is provide aid for restructuring, or part of it, a very small part of the second pillar deals with restructuring and organic agriculture, etc. But most of the second pillar in most countries is used to continue to support industrial agriculture, whether that be in the pig sector or in other sectors. A few days ago, I visited a project in Germany, in northern Germany, where a slaughterhouse for poultry was being built, which could kill 27,000 birds an hour, and that was financed by the European Union. Is this the kind of farming that we want, when we know that this kind of slaughterhouse requires 500 industrial poultry production units to supply it? So the second pillar of the CAP, which is financed by European taxpayers, should it be used to support this kind of production? I say no. It should be used to promote local markets and local processing, because that is in the interest of the 500 million European consumers. The small excess of pig production at the moment is being used to justify subsidies in the first and second pillar, and that is completely wrong. It's completely the wrong way around. So I think that we really need to use the 2013 reform to recalibrate the system, to make sure that it does serve the farmers' interests. And here I agree with Cadec. The CAP is not intended to oppose farmers' interests, but today it is actually leading to the loss of farmers' jobs. So clearly we need a different agricultural model, because the CAP is destroying farming jobs at the moment and has destructive and damaging effects on the environment. And there is also a problem in terms of the quality of the food produce that is produced. We could talk about dioxin, the dioxin crisis, and we could also talk about antibiotics. That's something that we'll be talking about later on, the use of antibiotics in factory farming. That is something which has a catastrophic effect for farmers and for those who work in these production units, but also for consumers in general.
Thank you. I'd like to answer as well. I greet my neighbour, MEP. You've started an interesting debate about protecting jobs, but if you look at the trend, and this I think applies to all areas where there's intensive farming in Europe, restructuring is taking place at the cost of jobs. There's a massive loss of jobs. The whole agro-food industry does this. We in Britain lose 2,500 jobs every year in production and 1,300 to 1,500 in the agro-food industry, and I'm sure that's true in other regions in Europe. So it's a combat we must all be involved in. We must adopt a rational approach to this and see what we can do in the future. We should learn what is good and what is bad. Secondly, there are other regions in Europe which are very productive. Some of you come from Denmark. I'm not sure that it is the country now which has the best income anymore, but if you look at the figures from our different regions, I'm not sure that concentration leads to the competitivity that some people claim. And another thing I think is very important, this crisis in pig farming is very different from other crises. The crisis is mainly because the supply, the fodder supply comes from elsewhere. If you look at the increases in cereal prices in my region over 1 year, about the first half of the first pillar of CAP money has gone to cereals. You see how vulnerable we are. We become very dependent. And if we become dependent on a supply like that, it means that the big firms have a monopoly. So what can we do? You've started the debate. It was a very good question. I think we must see what we can do to promote high added value production on the land locally. We don't want just to produce one standard product. We want to produce a diversity of quality products. We shouldn't give up and allow economics to drive agriculture. It's up to you, MEPs, and us local elected representatives to try and work out a solution together. I came here to try with you to try and build something which we farmers can't achieve on our own.
Thanks, Marek. Well, we haven't got much time, so I'll be quick. On the CAP, though, I do want to point out that the current debate on the CAP is much too focused on distribution of aid, but a policy like that isn't just about distributing public funding. That's an important part of it, but it's also a package of instruments, part of which is expenditure. Also, there's income, and there's other neutral things like quotas. They don't cost the authorities anything. I think we need to go beyond the current nature of the debate on direct aid. And in Foodsoft CAP, we are contesting the current context where prices are very low. And that is made up for by direct aid. So that does deviate from the debate. Producers want to have a form of social recognition. They want younger people to come in and take over from them. So they have to have prices that are regulated by the market, first of all. So I think it's important not just to focus on direct payments. As regards the environmental side, we're going to debate that now, but on everything that's been said about competitiveness, it's amazing what you hear about competitiveness in the Agriculture Committee or here. It doesn't make any sense economically. You have to talk to economists about it. You can't talk about competitiveness and include public aid. You can't say, yes, I'm competitive if part of what I get is public aid or state aid. If you get state aid, it means you're not competitive. And if you have a product below competitive prices, then you can't say you're competitive either. What is more, industrial farms don't pay for the costs of all this waste. They externalize their costs, such as water or green algae or whatever. It's what I call a negative multifunctionality. I could obviously talk at length about that, but in Denmark, for instance, they get subsidies for producing biogas in their waste, and competitiveness has to be without public aid, and producers have to take on the costs of the waste themselves. This industrial farming is not at all competitive. It just doesn't stand up economically. And lastly, because it's important, we've heard about health and safety standards, hygiene standards on small-scale processing. Very often, national law goes much further and is tougher than European law. There are exceptions which allow small slaughterhouses to be exempted. A German company was set up recently, processing meat locally. And it's very interesting. There's a lot of experience there about regulation in small-scale industries. And Commissioner Cholos recently said that there would be, next winter, there will be a conference on future regulations and standards that wouldn't just work on the basis of exemptions, but would be specific rules for small-scale processing. Now, for that to happen, the European Parliament also has to be involved in that process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you very much for organizing this event and for this discussion, which is very valuable. And I am convinced that it will leave some trace in our discussions, in our internal discussions in the European Parliament on the future of the CAP. But I would like to start by saying that as an MEP, not only as an MEP, but also as a farmer, I am in this part of the European society that is against factory farming in agriculture in general, and in particular in pig farming or in animal farming. But I have my own farm of 40 hectares, and we also raise pigs. But we only have 20,000 in the closed cycle, and this is pretty much the average in Poland. And we have 300,000 farmers, pig farmers in Poland. There are 300,000 farms that raise pigs, and there are 150 factory farms, as we call them. In Poland, well, when we call a place a farm, it includes in excess of 2,000 fatteners. What Mr. Siekierski said, we had this problem with the influx of very aggressive American capital to Poland, and then back then we had very loose regulations and we couldn't cope with the situation. But now the situation is different. Smithfield had to, or is in the process of changing its strategy in Poland, because it limits the fattening farms and produces piglets and cooperates with Polish farmers. There are about 1,000 Polish farmers that cooperate with Smithfield. But these are minor details. I, as a pig farmer, I should say that we lose out in Poland to not this kind of production that we saw in the film, but we lose out to our neighbors, to Germans or to Danes. We used to have 18-20 million pigs, but now we only have 13 million. So our production is defeated by more competitive goods that reach our country through supermarket chains from Germany or from Denmark. There are many reasons for that. There is a lot of integration, vertical and horizontal in Denmark. The Danes are co-owners of processing plants. They are interested in the financial results of the company and not the price at which their goods are sold. Our German colleagues, there is a lot of horizontal, and in France, horizontal integration. Once a week you establish a reference price for producers, and in Poland we are pretty scattered and we lose out, and that's the future of the CAP. I'm happy that we agree today. Mr. Bové has once again said that these inequalities between the old and new Europe in terms of subsidies cannot be maintained, but Mr. Bové is unfortunately a member of a very small group of people, or members of this parliament, from the old member states. And then we're going to talk about, in the European Parliament, about these issues, and we're going to vote, and then it will turn out that there are no political differences. There's no differences between the Conservatives and the Democrats and the left. The divisions are going to be as follows: the old 15 member states and the new 12 member states, and the vote will be who is in favor of maintaining huge support for the old 15 member states, and then they will vote in favor, the members from the old 15 member states, and we will be in the minority. But this is the major question about the future of agriculture, and then the question is what kind of European agriculture we're going to have. But now we're going to decide on the equal playing field in the common European market. And I hope that we still can count on Mr. Bovei's vote.
Denmark is a small country. We are 5 million people. We produce 25 million pigs. 20 years ago, I know that I'm probably not offending any of my colleagues saying that I know that some of you were members of the parliament 20 years ago. Well, 20 years ago I was just a boy and I had a paper route. I was driving my bicycle and I grew up in the countryside, just like Tracy. So most of the papers that I had to deliver was for farms. And on my route was about 40 farms. Now, when I go back and visit my parents today and I go the same route, there's 5. Why is this? Well, it's because we've had a change in which we go away from the small farms to the big farms. And I fear very much that that will happen also in Poland. Because what happens now is we see a situation in which, partly because of some success from the European Union in strengthening the environmental legislation, some of the farmers from Denmark are moving their production to Poland. The exact same style as we saw with Smithfield. You probably also saw that the director's name was Morten Jensen. That's a Danish name. That's not a coincidence. It's because these guys know how to do these things. They don't want small farms. They want big farms. They're multinational corporations, and the only thing that matters to them is how to make money. Now, in Denmark, the threat from the farmers, especially the pig farmers, are by far the biggest threat we have to our environment. Some of the threats were already explained quite well in the movie, but let me just mention some of the others. What happens when you put manure in the fields is that some of it is washed out into the streams and the lakes and the coastlines. Here, it means that the algae will grow. When the algae then dies, it leads to lack of oxygen. This is really the main problem. So we have a situation in which our lakes and streams and coasts are dying. I talked to a diver who told me what it was like to dive in a lake or in a coastline where there was no oxygen. He says, it's like if you imagine driving through a countryside and the grass is yellow, the trees has fallen down, the cows are laying on their backs with their legs up, everything is dead. If there's no oxygen, there's no life. This is what happens. And that's not even the worst problem. The worst problem is that some of this manure is then evaporates in the air and is carried by the wind. And then it over-fertilizes some of the most vulnerable nature sites that we have with the highest biodiversity. And this is also one of the reasons why in Denmark, even though we probably have the strictest legislation protecting the environment in Europe, we were the first country in the world to have an environment minister. Even though we have that, our biodiversity is very, very low. Why? Because of the farmers, especially the pig farmers. So what do we do about this? Well, even though I'm a very, very big fan of the film we just saw and of Tracy, I have to say that there's one point that I really disagree to. And that's when she was standing in front of the European Parliament saying, unfortunately, this is where they make our legislation. I can tell you, if we didn't have the European Union, if we didn't have EU legislation to support our environment, the situation in Denmark would be much worse. Right now, the only thing that's stopping the farmers to expand even more is EU legislation. EU legislation. The Habitat Directive, the Bird Protection Directive, the Water Framework Directive. And with the Water Framework Directive, when that's implemented, if we implement it correctly, this would be the biggest tool that we have, the best tool that we have. Now, we can do more. We can strengthen the legislation, and we should definitely do more to make sure that it's also implemented. But the CAP reform would, of course, be our probably most powerful tool. Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic. I very much share the analysis that not much is going to happen. I don't share the analysis that it's going to be the old countries versus the new countries, because we do actually have some of the old countries. Denmark, which is a bit weird because we make money on it, but still, the political situation in Denmark is that we want to get rid of the subsidies. Same in the UK and in Sweden. So there are some of the old countries that are actually working for this, but I know very well that that's not going to happen. Really, when you look at it, it's incredible that we have a situation in which we pay more than 40% of EU's budgets. That's an enormous amount of money to one sector. I mean, there's so many other things we could spend this money on, so it's really much more than we can afford. Do we then get cheaper foods? Well, probably not, because if the markets were free, or at least regulated in a different way, a lot of economists tells us that we would get cheaper food. Do we do it because we have a shortage in food? No, we did that when we started with the CAP, but that's many years ago. So, to sum up, you could say that we produce more than we need, we spend more than we can afford to produce more than we need, we pay more for the goods than they're worth, and we hurt our environment and torture our animals. Maybe we should change that. The point that I'm trying to make is that we do have the possibilities here, but we need to turn the opinions of so many members of this House, and we need to make it a question primarily of what kind of an agricultural sector do we want in the future. And unfortunately, right now, doesn't look like we would have much luck with that. So that brings us back to the regulation, and what can we do there? Well, apart from strengthening the environment legislation, we can also strengthen other kinds of legislation, animal welfare legislation. We can strengthen the legislation that we have now on animal transports, because a lot of these pigs are also being transported over large distances. That's why we can have these massive slaughterhouses that Jove talked about. The European Commission promised us more than 2 years ago that we would see a new proposal for rules for animal transports before the end of their term. We know it's been made, we just haven't seen it yet. I want to make it just a small commercial and then I'll stop. We have some of the members of the European Parliament have been kind enough to support a campaign that I've made that's called 8hours.eu, and 8 hours dot a lot of other things, because we have it in many different languages, where you can get people to sign a petition saying that we shouldn't allow animals to be transported for more than 8 hours. We already have almost 200,000 signatures, and it'll be a very good signal to send to the Commission. And I really also ask all of you, members and NGOs, to put pressure on the Commission, because we really need a new transport legislation as soon as possible. Thank you.
We have seen devastating effects on the environment and also in rural societies. And in the long run, this farm policy also threatens the resources we actually need to produce our food. Already today, close to 15% of EU land is affected by soil erosion caused by unsustainable land use practices. The UK paid in the year 2000 about £60 million to clean the drinking water from nitrates and phosphates. These are also environmental costs. And even we have seen I would call it bee crisis appearing, or a lot of bees are dying at the moment. So the commercial value of bees pollination is estimated at 228 million per year in the UK. It is hard to quantify all costs that might be caused or are caused already by unsustainable farm systems, but there are clear indications that the real costs of food production are borne by society indirectly and involve costs to individuals and communities who are not making decisions about these agricultural production methods. The high costs for water treatment already occur today. The costs for loss of biodiversity and fertile soils will rather concern the next generations. The market distortion that results from these systems that externalize their costs towards other farm systems with higher animal welfare and environmental standards, such as organic farming, puts these more sustainable systems in an unjust market position. This must be solved by better regulation, by environmental tax and pricing systems, but it can also be addressed now already in the next CAP reform that is under discussion now. We believe that the CAP is a great tool to shape farming towards more sustainability, and in the CAP it's really high time for a paradigm shift towards sustainable farming and a greener CAP. We should be careful not to do just greenwashing, but to set clear incentives for sustainable farm systems. Organic farming is it's a system approach towards sustainability, and as such, gathering many sustainability and animal welfare aspects under one system, under one certification system. Therefore, it's cost-efficient it is a cost-efficient measure to meet the EU objectives of sustainability and rural development. It requires to be handled as a priority under all measures of the new CAP. Farmers that maintain areas, land with a high natural value also require special attention. But also in the so-called first axis of the second pillar, investment support, we must make sure that all investments are of benefit for animal welfare and the environment. We should not support any more measures, buildings that are not beneficial for employment, for environment. Innovation is another point that has been raised in the CAP communication of the Commission last year. We believe innovation must keep farmers and society demands in sight and address the need for holistic, ecological and animal-friendly farming systems rather than focusing on simplistic technologies. Of course, cross-compliance must be implemented, and we believe that the bureaucratic burden for farmers, especially for small farmers, must of course be small, but it should not go on the expense of human health, environment and animals. We believe that the bureaucratic burden can rather be diminished by better coordination within the member states. So thank you very much.
What could be a slightly difference between us and other environmental groups is that we are convinced that there is a joint interest between small-scale farmers in Europe, in developing countries, and the environmental movement. And we think we have a joint interest to develop the food and the agricultural and the environmental policy in another direction than it currently is. I know that in several member states and within several stakeholders there are concerns that we as environmentalists with our ambitious demands could threaten the food security in Europe. And also in the communication from the Commission, from Commissioner Cioloş, it's distinct between maintain the natural resources and food security. We think it's necessary to change this perspective because farmers in Europe depend on fertile soil, they depend on water, they need biodiversity on their fields, they need biodiversity in breeding, and the European consumers need biodiversity in the food culture. This means that we can't allow that a handful of companies control the seed or the feed or the breeding sector. And the way how we consume and how we produce in Europe, and especially how we produce meat, how we produce dairy products, how we use our grasslands and how we use our cropland, has a major impact on the environment here within Europe, but also in developing countries. Because if you listen or attend the meetings of the Committee on Agriculture, there are a lot of representatives who are proud on the productivity of the European farms. I agree, we are very productive, but on which price? Because if you calculate or balance what we import and what we export, we are completely reliant on feed imports. Europe currently just produces 20% of their own protein feeds, and the rest is imported either from North America or the biggest part is imported from South America. And there it has a damaging effect of the environment. It contributes to the destruction of the rainforest, of the Cerrado, and it also has a negative impact of the health of the local communities because this soy production is linked with pesticides used and is very industrialized. But it also has an impact on the environment in Europe. The current CAP, as José Bové and René Louaille has already mentioned, has resulted in a completely disconnection between the livestock sector, especially the poultry sector, partly also the pig sector, I would say less, and the dairy sector, and the crop production. You can, farmers, or I'm not sure if it's in each case I will call them farmers, it's possible to produce 10,000 of poultry each year on 2 hectares of land because you can buy all your feed from our farms and you can have contracts for your manure. And we think if we discuss our vision of a future way, how we want to produce food and how we want to raise our livestock, it's necessary to abandon this disconnection and have a vision to come back how we can produce our own food, how we can produce our own feed for our livestock sector, and that there should be a relationship between the land sites and the animal that you can raise on it. So, as Friends of Europe, we say the solution is first, we need really a push for a protein production in Europe. This means it's not enough to have nice voluntary programs in different member states and not in all of them, where you could get some 30, 20 euros payments if you would cultivate peas or beans. This is not enough, and this will be never enough to find a solution. Therefore we think there should be a compulsory crop rotation, and one part of this crop rotation should be a protein crop, or to be more concrete, not just a protein crop, a legume, means peas or beans, clover, alfalfa, whatever. And due to the lack of knowledge, we also think it's necessary to offer the feed sector also some training, some research, and also the farmers, also the advisory system, how farmers, how poultry farmers, how pig farmers can use homegrown protein crops, because all this knowledge, all the skills have been lost, and it was more competitive to use soy from Latin America than to use the peas that you could cultivate or still cultivate on Polish fields. And the third demand is because it's also necessary that the breeders, the breeding sector, get a certain support or kind of a kick-off, because if you wouldn't support the breeding sectors with a really long-term development of new varieties, the farmers wouldn't get access to improved varieties. And besides this, we think it's necessary to abandon this indirect support for factory farms, because currently we have in different countries in Europe factory farms which are not acceptable, and we have a lot of local resistance against this farm, and sometimes they're directly supported, as José Bové mentioned, the slaughterhouse in Germany for the poultry, which they received funds from the second pillar for investments. So we think it's necessary to develop a vision which kind of agriculture and which kind of livestock sector do we want to have. And I think therefore it's necessary to say, not in the short term, but in the midterm, there should be a relation for the size of a farm and the animals you can raise on it. And we are also thinking about to say, because we have a problem with grassland. There's a much decline of grassland for different European countries, and say, okay, if we have this problem, in the last decades, it changed in the last year, there haven't been any kind of incentives for grassland farming. So if we want to change this, it's also not enough to have a voluntary scheme for the different member states, when there should be something really innovative to say, if you raise your pigs, if you have grazing pigs, why don't you have a top-up payment in the first pillar? This is really necessary. And I think we need really more than just minor changes in the CAP and discuss if there should be 2% more in the second pillar or 3% more in the first pillar. This is not what we need. The CAP is neglecting the role and the environmental impact and also the social impact of the livestock sector, and I think it's necessary, at least in the European Parliament, to rediscuss this. If you read the CAP communication from the Commission, there's one sentence or part of one sentence for encourage synergy between the livestock sector and the crop farmers. This is not enough, and if we want to change the situation, and if we don't have a full implementation of a Smithfield system in Europe, we really need major changes in the CAP. And therefore, we have clear visions, we have clear ideas, and we are convinced there's no kind of contradiction between environmental policy and farmers' policy. And just to remind you, if we discuss about farmers in Europe, these are not 2-hectare farmers. The average farm in Europe is still 12 hectares. The average farmer in Europe is a small-scale farmer, and if we develop vision for food and agriculture policy, let's think about the farmers in Europe and don't think about part of a lobby of farmers unions which are focusing just on the bigger farms. Because why should we focus on the big farms? They should be competitiveness enough. We don't need any kind of public support. If you can produce in which states of units, you don't need public support anymore. So let's say we introduce ceilings and we focus on the small-scale farmers and develop innovative systems, develop systems how they can locally market, how they can locally process, how they can organize a knowledge exchange on local or regional level, and focus on this. Because I'm sure a lot of farmers of Europe have enough ideas, enough background, enough skills, enough experience for an environmentally friendly pig, poultry, and dairy and cattle production. We just need to motivate and enhance this. Thanks.
Contrary to you, I can't say that I like this film. I didn't like it because it's a caricature of what's going on in Poland. On one hand, we have these big farms, and on the other hand, we have pigs that wallow in mud. But this is not the real situation in Poland. But we're not here to discuss the situation in Polish rural areas, because this discussion could have lasted for hours. But I would like to highlight one thing. There are many people in my part of Europe that disagree with this approach, that we should go towards the extensive approach in farming. And there was a scene in this film, it was cut out, it's on DVD, but it says that people in the west of Europe spend 20 to 30% of their income. People in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Hungary spend 60 to 70% of their income on food. So if we follow the path of extensive farming, these costs are going to increase, and people won't accept that. Well, this film says that many things that make sense. For example, labeling. There's no problem. No one in their right senses would object to put a label on a sausage or a piece of meat. It comes from Poland, comes from Germany, from an eco-friendly farm, from farms that use straw litter or don't use straw litter. But we can't have this wishful thinking kind of approach, because no one is going to be ever young and happy and beautiful forever. Well, the question is, shouldn't we stop persecuting, inverted commas, these huge companies, because they are treated quite restrictively in terms of, for example, liquid manure or how they dispose of it. Maybe we should focus on small and medium-sized producers. this is what we're lacking in Poland. The market is monopolized by hypermarkets, supermarkets that offer very cheap products because their costs, the food prices, pay a lot of are very important for us, and hence the problem.
Okay, Dan will answer the question.
If we are talking about the responsibility of the consumer, I agree that consumers do have a responsibility, and in the perfect world we wouldn't need politicians because the consumers would then make the right and informed choices on the market, and we would then treat our environment better, because not of ethical reasons, but because it would also be in people's own interest. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. I think that the assumption that we can solve environment problems and animal welfare problems by relying on the political consumer rests on two assumptions that I don't think will hold a test. First assumption that I don't think is true is that consumers are informed. Obviously, consumers are not informed. We can do more to inform them, and you could also argue, well, they should know that when they buy meat that are that cheap, that is probably not produced in a very good way. But the fact of the matter is, they don't know. We can do something to help them get a more educated choice, but it's very difficult giving people a full knowledge of the consequences of their choice when they buy things. It's also, I think, probably one of the reasons why we have a representative democracy, is that people don't want to think of all the choices that they make in their everyday life, all the consequences of that. They choose politicians to make those decisions for them. The second assumption is that people have a choice. When I was a student, I couldn't afford to buy organic meat in Denmark because it's very expensive. And now I can, so I do it, but a lot of people can't. So really the combination of a lack of knowledge and information and the fact that a lot of people don't have this choice makes it not really a good idea for us to only assume that the political consumer can help this problem. I think that we as politicians need to lift our responsibility and make regulation and make positive incentives for organic farmers and farmers that fulfill certain criteria, and make negative incentives for farmers that don't.
I remember that in the previous term of European Parliament we adopted 3 resolutions in which we expressed the very important declaration that animals are sentient beings, and animal protection, animal welfare is a challenge of our humanity, our culture, our civilization in Europe 21st century. And I think that we should remember this declaration, that we should respect this approach in practice. A situation which we observe in this film is against European law, against the present pig directive, and we can postulate more better control, better supervisory, and this situation should not exist in the future in Europe. This is one question: better control and respect European regulation which present exists. The second question is, I think that in future of common agriculture policy, we should stop subsidies for industrial farming, this big farm which we observe in this film. And I think that Mr. Siekierski's proposal that we should support, finance these farmers who have who cultivate land and who have the proper number of animals connected with this farm. It is a very good idea. We should to change the system of financing in common agricultural policy and support this type of farming when there is a land which is cultivated and the farmers who have animals use own feeds, etc. This is proper way. But I support very strong this idea that this type of farming which you observe on this film should be not financed. No euro cent should be spent for this type of industrial farming. This is, I think, this is the real thing which we can do. This is the good time for discuss about it, because we are at the beginning decisions about the future of the common agricultural policy, and we have to remember this discussion, and we have to try to introduce this into practice. Maybe okay. I will not to have long speech because we are a little late, and my suggestion is to give the floor for the next speakers. Once again, Tracy Worcester, that you made very good job to giving for us possibility to see your film, and we have to consider this situation which this film shows, and to remember it when we will discuss about the future of the common agricultural policy. Thank you very much.
I'm going to talk about the animal welfare implications. I'm going to first talk about the fattening pigs. Those are the pigs that are actually reared to provide meat. Then I'll talk about the problems with the breeding sows. We rear 250 million pigs every year in the EU. Nearly all of them are factory farmed.
What I mean by that is that they're kept in very barren systems. They've got no enrichment materials, even though by law, by EU law, they should be given straw or something similar. They're kept on fully slatted floors, and they're routinely tail-docked, even though that is illegal under EU law. Let me explain the problem about tail-docking. In natural conditions, pigs spend 75% of their day in activity. They root, forage, explore. When they're kept in these barren factory farms, they can't do that. They get very bored. They turn to the only thing that's in their world, which is the tails of other pigs. And not out of aggression, but out of boredom, they begin to chew and then bite those tails. And what factory farmers do is just slice off part of the tail, even though the science has for years told us the right way to prevent tail biting is not to cut off part of the tail, but to keep the pigs in good conditions, and above all, to give them enrichment materials like straw. So we're getting this routine tail docking, even though it's illegal. Now, the big problem we face is we have some quite good laws, but they are being widely ignored. We did an investigation recently on 6 big pig-producing countries. In virtually every farm we went to, there was no enrichment, and the pigs were routinely tail-docked. There was a similar investigation carried out by another organisation in France. Same result, breaking of the law, no enrichment, routine tail docking. Now, this is not just NGOs. The Commission's own Food and Veterinary Office carries out regular missions to the member states and has found that in many cases the pigs are not given enrichment, they're routinely tail docked. Finally, the European Food Safety Authority has said that over 90% of pigs in the EU are tail docked, despite the fact that it's illegal. This is how I'd like to see pigs being kept. If they're indoors, then they should be given straw and space. Even better is to keep them outdoors. So to sum up on the fattening pigs, the big problem is just that the laws that we've got, which are quite good, are being widely ignored. We need the Parliament and the Commission to put much more pressure on the Member States to enforce these laws. And I want to turn to the breeding sows. Their role on the farm is not so much to provide meat, though of course they'll be slaughtered for meat at the end of their lives, it's to produce piglets. And most sows in the EU are kept in sow stalls. These are stalls so narrow that the pig can't even turn round, and she's kept like that throughout her pregnancy, and for one pregnancy after another. Happily, these are banned in the EU from 2013, but there's still a couple of worries. Even after 2013, farmers will still be able to use these stalls for the first 4 weeks of pregnancy. However, the European Food Safety Authority, which reviews the science on animal welfare, has said that keeping them for these first 4 weeks in these narrow stalls will be bad for welfare. So what we want to see is that this first 4 weeks exception should be dropped. In other words, these sow stalls should just be banned altogether. Now, what I said, these sow stalls are used during pregnancy, and there could be one further problem. Farmers have got to put their sows into groups, not individually in stalls, but I fear that some of them will do that, but still come up with some pretty awful systems. These systems would actually be illegal because under the directive, even sows have got to be given straw or something similar from 2013. The directive prohibits the use of fully slatted floors for sows, and to prevent hunger, sows have got to be given some bulky food. The best way of giving them bulky food and providing enrichment is to give them a deep bed of straw, something like that, or of course ideally again for the sows to be outdoors. As I said, these stalls are used during pregnancy, but there's an equally nasty, inhumane system used when the sow gives birth. These are called farrowing crates. The sow's put in there about a week before giving birth, while she's giving birth, and for about 3 or 4 weeks afterwards till the piglets are weaned. So she's there for about a month. As you can see, they're even more restrictive than the stall. Sadly, these are not illegal. The science is very much supportive of our concerns about farrowing crates. We want to see sows being kept either in pens like this, in other words, not in narrow crates, but in pens where the sow's free to move. Now, the reason farmers use the crates is because sows can crush their piglets, they can lie down. But in fact, scientific research shows that a loose farrowing system, if well designed and well managed, can keep piglet mortality as low as these very restrictive crates. So they should either be like this, or again, they should be giving birth and mothering their piglets outdoors. So we need a big reform in which we end these farrowing crates. So a whole range of welfare problems which need to be addressed. I'm told I've got 1 minute more, but I've finished, so thank you very much.
Thanks. Hello, my name is Colleen Noonan. I represent the Soil Association, the organic farming organisation in the UK, and I'd like to thank Tracy for having invited me to speak here. So I'm here to speak about the human health consequences of the overuse of antibiotics in farming. Intensive farming still very much relies on the routine use of antibiotics. This is despite the fact that many people think that the excessive use of antibiotics was solved in 2006 when the EU finally banned the antibiotic growth promoters. However, this only had a very limited effect because EU law still permits the routine use of antibiotics in feed and in water for disease prevention, for prophylaxis. The only difference is you need a veterinary prescription, but many of the antibiotics which were previously used for growth promotion are used for prophylaxis. So this is sort of growth promotion and prophylaxis all in one. The industry which depends the most on antibiotics is the pig industry, followed by the poultry industry, i.e. the most intensive ones. In the UK, they account for 96% of antibiotic use in agriculture. Most of the remaining 4% is used by dairy cows, which are also farmed quite intensively. And just to give you an idea of the differences, in the UK there are fewer than 5 million pigs.
But there are 33 million sheep. Pigs use 60% of antibiotic use, and sheep use less than 0.3% because sheep are kept usually outdoors. So what are the risks to human health? Well, the risks fall into three categories. The first category, perhaps the most important, is the antibiotic-resistant bacteria which develop in the farm animals and can then be passed on to humans and cause infectious diseases which cannot be treated with those antibiotics. They can pass to humans either on food or through the environment or by direct contact with the farm animals. The second problem is that the use of certain antibiotics can increase the levels of some pathogens in the farm animals, thus increasing the risks to humans consuming the animal products. And the third risk is that some of the antibiotics, not most of them, but some of them are toxic and may leave residues in food. So dealing with the first problem, the major problem, antibiotic resistance, sometimes we hear from the industry that there is no evidence at all that farm animal use contributes to resistance in human medicine. However, both the World Health Organization and EFSA have concluded that there is clear evidence that some human resistance does come from the farm animal antibiotic use, although it is very difficult for a whole range of scientific reasons to prove exactly how much comes from farm animals, how much comes from humans. It's all a very controversial area. Nevertheless, there was a recent Dutch report by their Food Standards Agency which estimated that in the Netherlands 30 to 50% of resistance in humans comes from farm animals. I should point out that in the Netherlands they do have very low antibiotic use in humans and high antibiotic use in farm animals, so perhaps the figure might not be as high in other EU countries. So dealing with MRSA, which is one of the best known antibiotic resistant bacteria, in most countries, and certainly up until very recently, MRSA was mainly associated with the hospital use of antibiotics, not with farm animal use. However, in the past decade, a new strain of MRSA has emerged in pigs mainly, but also in poultry and in some dairy calves. This strain is called ST398 and it's widespread in many continental EU countries. It spreads to humans, particularly farm workers or vets, and it can cause serious infections, including deaths. And it is so widespread in pigs that some scientists are concerned that it will have the opportunity to mutate and become even more dangerous to humans in the future. It isn't, however, already we know that it isn't the only strain in European pigs, and in some EU countries there's another strain called ST1, and there are scientific reasons which suggest that it may, if it becomes as widespread as ST398, be even more dangerous to humans than ST398. Other examples of resistant bacteria which can get their resistance in farm animals and then infect humans are Salmonella and Campylobacter, and most resistance in these bacteria actually comes from farm animal use. It mainly does not come from human use, but it can cause serious problems in human medicine. With E. coli, it's more complicated and it's hard to say exactly where it is coming from. Nevertheless, we do know that some definitely comes from farm animals, and this is significant, particularly because there are now these highly resistant, a new form of E. coli which is highly resistant called ESBL E. coli, and which is present in livestock in Europe. And ESBL E. coli, although it's not as well known as MRSA in many countries, it already kills many more people than MRSA. The second major problem is the increase of certain pathogens. So the oral use of certain antibiotics can kill off good bacteria in the animal's gut, allowing other bacteria then to move in and become more widespread. The first example of this is Clostridium difficile, which until recently was mainly a hospital problem, but now in Europe there is a new hypervirulent strain of Clostridium difficile, called 078, which is present mainly in European pigs. And despite being virtually unknown in human medicine just a few years ago, it's become the third most common strain now in humans throughout Europe. So it's potentially a major a pathogen that is coming from intensive farming to humans. The second example of this phenomenon is Salmonella, which is really became a major worldwide problem only after the introduction of animal feed additives in the 1950s, and there's a huge amount of science showing the link with the use of antibiotics. The final problem is antibiotic residues. Many antibiotics are not particularly toxic and don't leave significant residues in food. However, the ionophore family of antibiotics, which are mainly used in poultry, they are toxic and they can leave residues, particularly in eggs. These ionophores, we know very little about their effect directly on humans, but there are a large number of studies in animals which shows that they've been linked to a range of diseases, including heart arrhythmias and sudden death syndrome. Unfortunately, we don't know what the full danger to humans is because the EU does not publish full safety data on antibiotics, so it's not possible for us to evaluate on what basis this is licensed in the EU, because the EU won't, and EU countries, not just the institution, won't publish the full safety data. So in conclusion, the overuse of antibiotics in agriculture has many serious consequences for human health. The growth in antibiotic resistances requires particularly urgent action because very few new antibiotics are now coming onto the market, and we're down to the last ones for certain diseases. The EU should have a full and open, should conduct a full and open review of the routine use of antibiotics in feed and water for disease prevention, because the ban on the growth promoters has not really solved the problem at all. And finally, the EU should publish antibiotic safety data so that it can also be independently assessed by scientists and other stakeholders. And finally, here is just a list of some of the Soil Association publications on these issues. Thank you.
I would like to say a few words about MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Staphylococcus aureus is nothing new. It's a bacteria well known in human medicine, in veterinary medicine. I'm representing veterinary medicine. And for years, it was, oh, thank you. It's a real risk for animals and humans. What is very important, the agent could be transmitted from animal to animal, from animal to human, from human to human, from human to animal. So it's multi-road, and the road of infection is very important in the change of infection diseases. This is the join point of veterinary medicine and human medicine, and if you look at the end of a change, it's a health consumer problem. Next, please. There's a lot of publication about MRSA, but it's not a scientific point of view. First strain of methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus was isolated in 1961, and then in 30-40 years it becomes really a problem. If you look at the human medicine and the human consequences for after the infection, it could cause a pneumonia or skin lesions or many other mild diseases, as we heard. Next, please. What really is a problem is the source of a infection. We have detected in veterinary field that there's a lot of carrier animals among animals in the farms. It's hard to prove in 100% sure that only in big farm animals there's a problem, but the large part of a problem lays in a big and intensive farming of animals. What species of animals are involved? Mainly pigs, sheep, poultry, and cattle. And it's not only the farm animals, because the agent could spread from animals to humans and vice versa. Also, our companion animals are in danger, like dog, cat, horse as a pet, and also exotic animals. We do not think that we or our children, when we play with fluffy animals, sometimes we could be in danger, especially if we are under the stress condition. The carrier state is a state that even veterinarians, we do not see any clinical signs of disease. From the first sight, it's like a healthy animal, so nothing goes wrong. But if you take a swab, make a culture, what happens? In pigs, up to 25% in pig population could be carrier animals. In some research, we could find that 40% of a population in such a farm could be carrier animals. And in humans, in risk group, as we heard some minutes ago, veterinarians, animal takers, stockholders, it's about 20%. And the risk of disease appearance, there was one research made in North America. The risk of appearance of a disease in humans that stay close to animals is more than 700 times more than in the rest of the population. Primary reservoir of Staphylococcus aureus, and not only, but we are talking about such a problem today, are pigs, then calves, and broilers. The next point of a speech is a drug resistance. It's really, of course, it's not a mass problem today, but in some cases, I believe nobody would like to be the case. It's a real problem. If there's just a simple infection, something on the skin or just pneumonia, and there is no drug that could be used to treat the disease. And in some cases, it ends with a death, unfortunately. So most of a methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus strains of these bacteria are also resistant to tetracycline, trimethoprim, aminoglycosides, and quinolones, which are very, very popular drugs in use in veterinary medicine and also in human medicine. What is a danger, or what factors impact the danger for humans? As you can read, intensively reared food producing animals. Also contaminated food. We can eat something which was contaminated during the process of production. And of course, slaughterhouses and abatters. And it's not only an animal. Humans also could be a carrier because they have a close contact with the animals, which enables the pathogen to jump from one species to another. And raw meat, if you like to eat it, remember. One of the factors that make fasten the drug resistance and spread of these pathogens is excessive use of antimicrobials for prevention of disease. It was said today 5 or 6 times. It's a fact, unfortunately. As humans, we would like to have healthy food, happy animals, but sometimes it's not a good way that we are following in order to catch the goal. Of course, if the bacteria is resistant for treatment, it's expensive to treat And sometimes, unfortunately, there's a lot of losses in production. This is the end. I hope this happy, not this one, this happy pig you will remember from this presentation. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Charles Fraser from the World Preservation Foundation. I'd just like to know, within the context, global context, where the UN is reporting imminent food riots, and we have 40 million children who die every year of because they can't afford to buy food. Why we are not concentrating on promoting a more plant-based diet?
Very industrial systems, of which pig farming is a very good example, are massively inefficient, and they're inefficient because they're totally dependent on feeding grains and soy to the animals, and every study shows that the amount of nutrition you have to put into the animal with grains and soy is very much less than the nutrition you get back out of the animal in the form of meat. So we do need to have farming systems that are not dependent on feeding huge quantities of grain and soy to animals, and that really means going over to much more ruminant production, because the great efficiency of cattle and sheep, if raised on grass, is that they are converting food that we cannot eat, grass, into something that we can eat. So let's move away from very industrial pigs and poultry, and indeed industrial cattle, to extensive and probably much more ruminant-based agriculture. That's a very simple answer to a complex question. Thank you.
The reason that we have, part of the reason that we have such intensive pig and poultry production is because, like us, they are monogastric animals. They are not ruminants, and they can't eat grass. And this is because, and they don't have, like we don't, the ability to eat grass because they don't have the same complex microorganisms in their gut. And as a result, we can feed them antibiotics daily, and this does help protect their health if they're kept in terrible conditions. Quite simply, you cannot do that with ruminant animals, and in particular with sheep. You can do it to some extent with cattle, but it's very, very difficult with sheep. And this is why, essentially, the sheep have escaped and they're out in the fields. It's because of antibiotics, largely, because the ruminant animals sheep get sick if you feed them antibiotics. You have to inject an antibiotic and treat them generally individually, whereas the monogastrics ones, you can feed them the antibiotics. And the other point about the ruminant animals is not only can they eat food that we can't eat, they can bring nitrogen into the whole system. Because if they eat a grass clover lea, that grass clover lea is constantly fixing nitrogen, and they are eating that, and the very fact that they are eating that is enabling the land to fix more nitrogen, and you can then rotate and grow crops in that field without using any artificial fertilizer. On the other hand, the pigs and poultry are eating grain which is produced with they not only are our competitors for food, but they are also taking nitrogen out of the system rather than bringing it in essentially for free.
Thanks to the organisers. This is a very useful debate today, and thanks to Tracy for the video. I'll be brief. As has been said several times today, standards in the EU in animal welfare and the environment and so forth are very high. They're the highest in the world, and it's not coincidental. It's because of the work done here in Parliament, in Council and in the Commission. What we have no control over here is global standards, and the difficulty thus arises when we negotiate trade agreements, free trade agreements with other world powers, as is being done all the time. When we talk about new standards, as was mentioned by Mr. Jorgensen earlier, new transport or new other animal welfare standards, we must remember that every new law created here raises the bar for European standards, but not for those in the rest of the world. Every new law increases the costs on European farmers, thus making them more uncompetitive in the world stage. So products on supermarket shelf, be they pork, be they eggs, whatever, that have been produced in less regulated societies are going to be cheaper than the equivalent EU products. That's the bottom line. So by making our farmers here animal welfare friendly, environment friendly producers uncompetitive, we're actually in danger of undermining ourselves and encouraging lower global standards. This is the danger. So by all means, let's continue talking about animal welfare. Let's continue to push animal welfare standards, but let's not do so in a way that puts our farmers out of business, and let's encourage the rest of the world to catch up with us. Thank you.
I do agree with you, and even here in the European Parliament we agree on that, because the European Parliament has expressed its opinion many times in line with that. In the Agriculture Committee we come back to this problem every time we debate something. We should have the same requirements for the European farmers and producers, as well as for all those who export their products to the European Union. This is a very simple rule, but it's very difficult to put into practice. Well, you said we don't have an influence on the global rules, but we don't even try. Animal protection today, well, I said about this declaration that we treat it as a challenge for humankind. And this is the high time that there are there were certain minimal standards as far as animal welfare is concerned, and it should be treated as a non-trade standard. It should be treated as a non-trade value in all the international trade agreements. But why does this not happen? Well, in the former term of office, I think it was Commissioner Mandelson who was dealing with trade at that time, he responded quite frankly that we do not protect the interests of our farmers in international trade because there are some other issues in industry, because industry accounts for 85% of our foreign trade and agriculture accounts for only 15%. But this is a wrong approach, because if our representatives, people who represent the European Union outside in international trade negotiations, sacrifice agriculture and the good of this sector in the name of other sectors, well, I think this is a very wrong approach, and this will threaten our food security in the European Union in the future. Here in the European Parliament, I think we understand this issue quite well, but it has to be also shared, this understanding has to be shared by the other institutions in the Council and the Commission. But I fully support this direction, this line of thinking, that we should have the same standards. We should raise animal welfare standards, and we should raise this issue with regard to international trade standards.
There's always the assumption that better welfare is an economic disadvantage, and indeed sometimes it is a problem. We do need to also look for the kind of win-win situations where better welfare can be economically beneficial in terms of healthier animals, lower veterinary costs, lower mortality. Certainly, my own background, I'm a lawyer. I've got some expertise in WTO, and I think we in the European Union could actually go much further towards requiring imports to meet standards roughly equivalent to our own. The final point I'd like to make, as I'm sitting next to one of the vice presidents of the Parliament's Agriculture Committee, is I agree with Linda McCavan earlier that clearly the CAP isn't the answer to all our problems, but it is being reformed at the moment, and I'd love to see the Agriculture Committee, which is obviously in the lead on CAP, looking at how can we use the CAP, how can we support farmers with the costs involved in moving from very industrial pig and poultry systems to something more sustainable and humane. I really think we mustn't lose this opportunity of influencing the debate on the CAP, because there's a lot of money there which could and should help us move away from factory farming to something better and healthier.
I wanted to pick up on what a representative of Ireland said. In the previous term of office, I worked on the REACH directive on the chemical industry, and in the REACH package we had imposed on the importers the obligation to comply with EU legislation, i.e. the REACH package. So the aim was to eliminate dangerous substances from chemical products which are exported to the European Union. And this obligation was also imposed on importers who are obliged to require the compliance with this legislation. But on the other hand, we also heard that 250 million pigs which are kept in Europe, 250 million pigs are kept in inhumane conditions, in appalling conditions, which flies in the face of what we are trying to achieve, i.e. Animal welfare. Thank you. Yes, I would like to ask, and I would like to invite Tracy to Poland to see what the situation is like now, because the film is about the past. Of course, the film is very good, but the situation has changed in Poland, and I would like to invite you to Poland to see it firsthand. So if we the situation has changed, and we should not punish Polish farmers who are decent people, because the film is about the past. The film is not about the present. So I would like to invite you to Poland to see it firsthand.
The bottom line is go and see the Romanian farms, and maybe you realize that it's still as bad there, and it might have cleaned up a bit in Poland.
Proszę Państwa, ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, I would like to thank you very much, and especially Tracy Wooster and other panelists who presented the interesting presentations, and all the guests who came in such large numbers to this event. Numerous members of the Parliament, representatives of NGOs from many countries all throughout Europe. There were veterinary doctors, scientists, and we're very happy. This meeting was not aimed at presenting certain ready-made recipes. It was rather a brainstorming session, and we wanted to make people think of what's going on at present and what needs to be changed. But there are these 6 asks, and they are very specific, and they should be implemented in practice. And we'll try to take that into consideration in our work here in the European Parliament. With regard to what Mr. Siekierski has just said, I would like to tell you that the situation in Poland that is depicted in the film was indeed met with huge interest. In Poland we have the so-called Supreme Court of Audit. I am very familiar with it because I was its chairman before coming here, and the Supreme Chamber of Audit some 3 years ago carried out an inspection. Mr. Kryda knows about this inspection. This was a very in-depth inspection that revealed a very difficult situation, which was not far from what we saw in the film. But I hope that today, after this inspection, after the implementation of certain conclusions drawn from this inspection, the situation has improved, and I believe it's better because there are more controls, there are more inspections in Polish farms, and I believe that the situation in Poland is better. But it doesn't mean that we have to rest on our laurels and stop taking interest in this issue. But we have to strive for at least the directive to be observed, and the European and the members of the European Parliament should approach the European Commission and the Member States to do so. Another thing, I am fully convinced about that, and I try to convince my colleagues that we should strive for this kind of farming not to be supported from European funds. And in the CAP and in its objectives, it says that one of the objectives of the CAP is to support environment-friendly farming. Maybe this is not a very and it shouldn't be intensive pig farming because it's not environment friendly. So we should do something in line with what Mr. Siekierski has said. We should support these farmers who cultivate land and also raise animals. Maybe this could be a solution. I don't know what the standards should be, but maybe we could come up with some additional top-ups for these farmers that have animals, their own animals, and they feed them with their own feed that they produce themselves. I think this is the right direction we should go in. Now, there are still some lengthy discussions ahead of us. We'll come back to this film and to this discussion that we've had today. I'd like to thank you once again, Tracy, for this inspiring piece of work, because we really needed it in our considerations and for the future. Thank you very much once again, and I would like to invite you to a small reception that is outside of this room, and the chairman kindly thanks the interpreters as well.
Don't forget to look at the 6 asks at the back of your program and make comments or sign your name on it and leave it at the reception so we can work with you in future.
Could you just say, what did you think was very, very strong points to get out of today that we should put in our press release?
I think the main important things which is in this conference and is this meeting is the dialogue, the real conversation between MEPs from Eastern and Western countries. This is, I think, since the beginning of the second this mandate, the first time MEPs from agricultural committees speak really in a concrete way on this issue. Also, on their implication in the CAP reform, but not only in CAP reform, in sanitary measure and all the issues for persons, human, and also on animal welfare. So I think it's quite an important event.
I think that today's conference, today's meeting was very successful. Many parliamentarians, members of the European Parliament, participate in today's meeting, and discussion and opinions of parliamentarians are very interesting, and I think that it was very, very good idea to organize this conference. Because we are at the beginning of our debate about the future of common agricultural policy, and we have to change the structure of the common agricultural policy. There is a more and more popular idea to stop financing of the industrial farming, industrial agriculture, and to spend more money for the support of the small scale or medium scale farming. And this movie, which was presented in the Tracy Worcester movie, and debate after the presentation of this movie is going in this direction. And I hope will be the results of this Congress will maybe, I hope, will be easier to achieve our goals in the future of common agriculture policy. Maybe it will be easier to change everything which was not good to this time, this policy. Congratulations, Tracy. Thank you again, because it was very, very good job.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for doing it. So do you think that your statement of what is the most important thing, that the amendment that you could include in the common agricultural policy, what is it that you're trying to put in there?
First of all, to stop financing of the industrial farms. The first. The second, support your idea to labeling of the labeling of food. And the third question, more support for the traditional farming, and it's a very good idea to support more farms and who cultivate land and who keep animals in the same farm. It's very good idea to have preference for this type of farm, natural farming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, today I think was a very open debate that embraced what are the major challenges for the future of European agriculture. We had elements that have never been really discussed with concrete cases like today. We have not to do a process of the past, it's to build up about the future and from the mistakes that have been done. There is the integration about several elements, but the most important is to believe that farming is something very important for Europeans, and it is a value that could save the citizens, could really bring food, happiness, and it has to be safe. But the most important is that, like in the movie was a moment of transparency, a moment of reflection that brought a clear message: you should see what's going on, because many people don't know. The real moment was when people realize and touch the reality of this thing. And to start a debate and to develop on this, as you know, at European level is extremely important, because the European policies are really the key policies, are done here. It's an house where in fact people have their own voice, and also, as been said during the meeting, why it was a milestone? Because it's the first time in which common agricultural policy will be discussed with a co-decision. The Parliament will have a stronger say, the Commission is having the role to play in the decision making, but with different weights in the future, comparing with previously. That's why the voice of this meeting, what is coming out, is really essential for the future debate.
Did you get some interesting input from the MEPs in the room that were actually, you felt they were really listening and they really changed their opinion from before? Do you think that it actually made an impact?
Yes, I think the first thing is that you had MEPs from different areas that are key person in different committees of the European Parliament, and the role of each of these committees, environment, agriculture, trade, each one of these play an important role in what is an agriculture that has to develop in a global game. It's a global market, more and more in the future. Competitors are not the same of 2000 when we revised the first CAP in Europe. Nobody was thinking about China as a player as it is today, or having to think about the effect of companies that have a global play, a global say that affect the life of rural areas as it is. So each member of this committee, each member of the Parliament is having his own task in the future to lead the debate, to prepare the reaction of the Parliament, and to express their views in front of the movie and in front of the people is what is really essential to stimulate the debate, and to grab also the views from the different stakeholders.
Yes. Do you remember the comment from the Polish minister saying that Poland it's an old film?
Yeah. I mean, it is very delicate. In fact, the balance between the Parliament and what the minister expressed in the Council has been said today. But this is also very good, in my opinion, because everybody is positioning his own role in the future debate. The ministers representing the member state, the Parliament representing the people of Europe, and the Commission, that is the executive. Today, probably what is missing was the Commission. That's why it will be very important to grab more and more this. But as you remember, Commissioner Cholos, the Commissioner of Agriculture, was mentioned several times by different members of the Parliament, and in fact the contact and the interface is very much ongoing. So this will only strengthen the debate, and we identify the players.
No, I think it was very helpful, not just for us in our work against pig business and for good pig sustainable production, but also that helps the whole debate on not just on pig business, but also it was a lot discussed on the CAP. And also I think that there was participants in the room which are in favor of this business. And the fact that, for example, Cargill was forced to come, that they have phoned before, that the Commission was forced to come, it's a sign that something happened there. Then they have to be there. So I think the influence of such initiative in the whole debate, and not just the institutional one, and the public debate, I think it's a great success for me.
Very good. Okay. So what is your work now in influencing the amendments to the Common Agricultural Policy?
Yeah, now we are working on the institutional, we are working on two different strategic levels. One is to work inside the institutional discussion, it means inside the proposal of the Commission, what the European Parliament is discussing now. So we will put amendments and make lobbying. Tomorrow we are meeting the rapporteur, Albert Dess, and where we say our technical proposal on such premium, but we have the other strategical perspective, and also inside also the Food Soft-CAF movement, is to work to raise more awareness and more political force around the food sovereignty framework of the CAP, because we know with that framework, with the framework which is discussed now in the Parliament and in the Council, we will not achieve even the goals what the Commission is claiming for. And so we have to, for example, we have to lobbying also to convince more and more people, not just the politicians, that we need supply management, for example, that without supply management, not just of pig production, of any production, we will never achieve to have fair price for the farmers. And this is just one part of the debate. But now in the proposal of the Commission, there is no supply management at all.
Right, so you are bringing in a completely new type of Common Agricultural Policy setup, the number 4 option.
Yeah, it's not totally new, because we have learned from the past. We are working on this since the end of the 70s now. So, and we have learned from the past what is good, what is bad, where are the perverse effects. So our proposals also, it's a combination of new instruments. For example, the ceiling, there was never ceiling, but also of some instruments which were used in the past but not on the right way. So on the I would say what is important that are the objectives, and after the instruments we have to propose them to make the politician convinced and to experiment them and to change them when they are not right, or because there are always some perverse effect of instruments, etc. But the most important is that the objectives we are pursuing in the debate, and our problem, our most important political problem, is that our framework is not compatible with the present international trade rules. And it's clear, we know that what we are proposing are not compatible. And it's not naturally very difficult for the European Union, for the institution to say, yeah, we have to change the international trade rules, because it was signed in 1994 by 150 countries. But because of all global crises now on the table, I think that there is a political space, there is an opportunity to change, because when we see all the global crises, on our way, we have to change. There is no, we cannot escape this. But there is some huge space, huge political
opportunity.
No, but it takes time till, especially the politicians, because they are in structure and they are used and to take this in account. And the problem is that it would be better that they have to take this in account, not in a hot crisis time, but in normal and regular political time. And the problem is that we hope we don't need catastrophe to change, because by any catastrophe, it's always catastrophic for the weakest. So,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay, can I just ask you sort of 3 things that you felt was strongest from the members of can you tell me 3 things that were strongest from the MEPs that were asked to the table, that you felt there is a change in attitude from people that are more on your side, to recognise that farming is a skill, that we shouldn't be dealing with farming as if it was some washing liquid. It's different to dealing in commodities that are not essential for man's survival.
I don't know if I've cleared 3 points, but one important point, I think, it's that some MEPs, for example from Poland, agree on a confused way that what is going is wrong. But they are still more or less defending. They don't want to attack this factory farming. They naturally use the employment argument, etc., as usual, but they are feeling that it does not go on the right way, but it's difficult for them to go on the next step to say, yes, we will discuss new law to progressively ban factory farming, because they are naturally under pressure probably in their country. And also, and it is a point which should be also worked on, because they are always using the argument of employment, and we know that they are destroying more employment than creating, but it's always used. So we have to have good answer to this. And also I think that it's also more clear all the environmental issues regarding factory, and the film naturally explained this, and I think that there is also more awareness, and also with all global environmental crisis, I think MEPs are more ready than yesterday to act on this. But there is also a difference between that they can say and when they will vote.